Hello and welcome. My name is Alexia. Welcome to the Fear-Free Childbirth and Motherhood Show page. Today we're going to be talking about fear of death and dying around childbirth, which is a topic that really does not get talked about enough, but is a huge fear for many, many women around birth. Now, today I'm going to be joined by Holland. Now, Catherine is someone that has been a guest on the podcast. So if you have been listening to the podcast and certainly back from season 1, then you will recognise Catherine and her story. But if not, don't worry. We are going to hear all about that all over again. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Now, we had a little bit of a catch-up not long ago, and we started going off on a little bit of a rant around this. And I was like, we need to stop right now and make this a live conversation so that people can hear what we're saying, but also share what their perspectives are on this, because I know that when I work with women around tocophobia, the extreme fear of birth and pregnancy, a fear of death and dying comes up all the time. It is so widespread, and I just don't see it discussed enough. So that's why we're having this conversation today. So anybody watching, please come and say hello, but also please don't hesitate to put your questions in the comments, because I will be bringing those as part of the conversation, and we want you to be taking part in this as much as anything. So Catherine, over to you. So would you mind just introducing yourself a little bit for those that don't know you, so that we can have a little bit of an understanding of your story and how come that we're here together today talking about death and dying around childbirth?
Well, I suppose it's quite a woven story, because I come to this from several different angles. My first contact with you and with the podcast was about breastfeeding, because I was a breastfeeding counsellor for many years, and then also about rebirthing, which is a breathing technique. Conscious connected breathing is its real name. People remember their birth as a time of stress and change during that. And one of the reasons that people need rebirthing or go for learning about it is because they've got fears of from birth or death or various other big deals, fear of being alone or whatever those things might be that lead them on. And also during my rebirthing practice, I have come across people who want to die, across people who are not comfortable and happy where they are. I've also had friends who I've been able to support as they're dying by being able to talk directly about birth. And my main personal reason for all of this is because I was driven into by a drunk driver, and I was aware that my body was in the road and I was looking down on it, and that the place that I was going to, I was travelling through, was absolutely wonderful. And the only thing that brought me back was a question in my mind: do you want to carry on towards the light where everything is wonderful, or do you want to go back and see your children grow up? And if I hadn't had children, I wouldn't have come back, because the place I was just wonderful. So with that personal knowledge as well as all the other collective bits, I'm able to hold the various experiences and a point of view which is not as nervous about looking at death and talking about death as people often are. And there's one other point in there. I was drawn to have home birth myself. And so I've had 2 of my children at home. I have 3 children. The first was only born in hospital because my young husband at the time was nervous. And so I agreed, which I wish I hadn't now, because I was the one having the baby. And by the time the second one came, he was completely unflapped by the whole thing, because he'd seen just how exciting the whole thing is as far as medicine, safety, all those things are concerned, because it's a normal physical activity which you shouldn't be going anywhere for.
So let me just recap, just to wind back to your own story. So you were on a motorbike and you were hit by a drunk driver, and so you were lying in the road, left for dead, to die.
Yeah.
And so you describe a moment where you you had a death experience and you were going towards the light, and you made a decision to come back so that you
Yes.
could see your daughter grow up. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. My 3 children. I have
Yeah.
3.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, I was in fact bleeding. I was bleeding very hard because my left lower leg had been detached, and you can imagine how much blood comes out when you sever arteries like that.
Mm.
So in a few minutes, I was close to death.
Mm.
So and I understand biologically what happens is if your blood pressure drops very quickly, then your body closes the artery. It has a sort of a mechanism where it can elastically shut itself.
Mm.
It recognises where the bleeding is coming from and it closes it off. So that must have been the moment at which I was, first of all, under the impression that I was dying and that my consciousness was leaving me, and then also that I could come back again.
Mm. And I'm it just my kids are always telling me, they're always saying to my partner, Daddy, when you die, you're going to be gone. But it's all right, Mummy. Mummies can come back because they've seen the Mummy Returns. But then today I was like, I'm actually going to speak to a mummy today who did return.
Oh, wow.
And I think this idea of choice, of you making this decision to come back, is just wonderful, and how being a mother does give you this power to do such an incredible thing.
Yeah,
But
very much
also,
so,
I just
yeah.
wondered if you could maybe expand on what that feel like. What was that experience like for you? Like, you said it was a very beautiful place. You could see the light. I mean, what can you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
Well, it's a bit like the classic descriptions, and enough people have done it and come back to be able to say that you feel as though you're in some sort of tunnel. You feel as though you're traveling through the tunnel, and there is a point at which I hesitated, and the question was almost as though it was spoken to me by me. It was as though it was my own voice in my head saying, "Do you want to carry on? You know, this is pretty wonderful, or do you actually want to see your children grow up?"
Mm.
And that was sort of like a tug, because I was also aware enough to know that the place I'd gone to was painless, and if I went back into my body, it would be excruciating, because not only had my leg been smashed, but all the skin had been torn off it.
Mm.
So it was really, really painful, understandably so.
Yeah. And so just could bring this over to, women today that they have a fear of death, they have a fear of dying. Is there anything that you'd like to, and if anybody's watching, if this is you, then feel free to sort of, let us know, and what your own, if you've got any questions that you would like to put to Catherine, then do let us know. But is there anything that you'd like to kind of say to them, for somebody that does have a fear of death or dying based on having the experience that you've had?
Well, the first thing to say is that it's truly wonderful, and it's not an end. It's definitely no ending involved. Of yourself. There is an end to your physical body, but it's the vehicle that that your body is like the car that you're in driving, and the sense of self, of identity, is like the driver. So you can get rid of the car, but the driver just steps out and goes and does something else, or gets into another one. So there's no need for that. But the main reason for having this conversation today is to say that death is not naturally a part of birth. Biologically, the birth process is very successful indeed. I don't know how many mammals there are on the earth, something like 5,000 different types, probably more. But the birth process is very, very successful. It's extremely well organized, it's very well designed, and if you feel an urge to go somewhere, that's the very thing you shouldn't be doing when you're in labour.
What do you mean by
So,
the urge to go somewhere? What do you mean by that?
well, I believe that it's fear that makes women decide, for example, to leave their home and go and give birth somewhere else.
Mm.
If we weren't afraid at all, and we knew and trusted our bodies, and we'd witnessed, which many women have, particularly those with pets, the birth process is very successful. It's not a dangerous process. In fact, the only dangerous thing in birth is to go to a strange place where you might get infection, because for a time you have a raw wound. So the very worst thing you can do is to go somewhere where you meet microbes that you're not familiar with. The safest place you can be is your home, the place you know, with the people and things around you that you're familiar with, because you've got antibodies to all of them. That's why I'm associating. Well, I want to disassociate it. I want to disassociate the idea of birth with an automatic risk, and perhaps introduce at this point, if this is the right point, my study of childbirth traditions isn't quite the right word. Interference is a better word. Where anybody has had an idea that they want to thwart the birth process, they produce danger. Because every part of the birthing process, as it rolls, it's got a pattern to it. It's got a predictable set of activities that take place in the body that are all shadowed and guided and guarded by other processes that take place. As Maureen Minchin said about breastfeeding, which is the same, there's been something like, 10 million years of practice of our bodies that have a very high intelligence, not this brain intelligence, our body intelligence, been practicing it for eons, and only 150 years of people who think that they can invent something better. And it's, I was introduced to a new word, hubris, apparently extreme arrogance. We are extremely arrogant if we think that our cortex can design something better than our whole biological history has been able to design, very successfully indeed. So unfortunately, women have been trained to listen to people apart from their own bodies. Well, perhaps men have too, perhaps we all have. And along with that goes a doubt about things that our body is strongly trying to tell us. And those people who train or retrain in any sort of meditation or spiritual practice start to realize how much you can accentuate that intuition. In fact, it was something I promised myself when I started rebirthing, was that I really wanted to hone my intuition. And it's got extraordinarily good, because the part of us that doesn't die is there when we're alive as well. Some people call it soul, some people call it spirit, whatever it is, it's the invisible part of us. That invisible part of us knows what's happening in the future as well as what's happened in the past, and we can trust it. So if we're ever in doubt and we have the facility to be able to listen to that, then we have all the answers we need.
And so what do you think helps people to hone their intuition? What, in your experience, do you think is a practice that can help somebody to just, hone it so that they can trust it more, listen to it more, so they can use it to guide them?
Well, there are actually quite a lot of different techniques now, more than I realised. I'm a curious person. I've started experimenting in all sorts of ways, including with diet to quite a big degree. So the breath work was my first port of call. I know people use meditation. There are lots of practices which appeal to different people, but they all have the same sort of end point, desirable end point. I know that what people call clean eating, if you start eating a lot more raw food, you really begin to feel it. One of the things I did early on was to stop eating dairy produce because I was allergic to it, and it really gave me a very thick head, clogged me up and clogged my sinuses, my ears, and made my nose run and made me sneeze. And if you've had a cold, how difficult it is to think when your head's all stuffy. So then I met other women who, in breastfeeding groups, who had found that if they stopped eating meat, their menstrual cycle was much, much gentler. And I'd found that with stopping dairy. But then if you start introducing lots of live foods, you will notice huge differences. And I think one of the reasons I survived that accident, because apparently I lost 4 pints of blood, which is half of it. I think that's because I'd been eating half raw for, I don't know, 15 years or something before that. And I only drink water. So that's another thing that people do. Some people find if they give up alcohol, la la la. I don't like using the word give up too much, because the gains that you make are far, far greater than anything that you put aside. And also, to take raw food as an example, you can make cakes and chocolate puddings and ice cream and everything. You can just make them with things that haven't been cooked and are good food.
Now, just to touch back on death in birth, and you're talking about how, childbirth is a very successful process. It's been honed for years, millennia by nature. I know that those women that do have a fear of birth, they kind of, when they hear that, they go, well, they hear people say, well, it's a natural process, it's going to be fine. Women are doing it all over the time. They find that very difficult to hear because they then are immediately drawn to those situations, stories that you hear where a woman has died in birth and some things do go wrong, and and so those that are fearful tend to kind of very much focus on the things that will go wrong because their fear is this pattern that's in place. So what do you say to those people that are going, yeah, but these things can go wrong, I can die, maternal mortality rates are very high, this is why I'm scared?
Yeah, well, there are two parts to that. One is that by a technique such as rebirthing, you can meet those fears, but with your fear of techniques, you can address those fears. The thing to bear in mind is that the reason we're afraid is something in our history. And so looking at what happened to us and why we've come to those conclusions is very helpful. Because then it becomes a logical thing rather than something that we feel is illogical. And if we think something is rational, we can address it rationally and we can say, what do I need to do to help myself?
Yeah.
And then the other part of that discussion is that if you choose to focus elsewhere, you can train yourself to a different story. You can train yourself to a different outcome. And there are enormous numbers of beautiful videos of births, gentle births, home births, happy births, powerful births, just beautiful, beautiful births to find and watch. I started making a collection of them because I thought, I'd like to be spreading the propaganda of look how gorgeous and beautiful this is. And since that, I've been at the birth of my granddaughter. My daughter's had a baby. I wasn't at the birth of my son's daughter because I'm not his wife's mum and I wouldn't expect to be. But she's had a home birth now as well. So this is quite interesting. And I'm seeing a huge upturn, and as the work you're doing, in people taking charge. People taking charge of their own experience because they realise that their personal collection of history is unique, that they're the only person with it. So it's up to them to do something about it. Of course, you can seek help, assistance, and paid experts to help you. And fair play to you if you do. Because as you've said to me, and we all know, you never, ever forget birth.
No.
As a mum, you never forget giving birth. As a baby, you never forget being born. And one of the fun things about rebirthing, and the reason it got its name, is that you often remember your birth. About 80% of people who have been through the rebirthing process, conscious connected breathing, have remembered their birth. And I'm one of those people. And it's fascinating.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I know that with my work around tocophobia, which is the extreme fear of birth and pregnancy, so many, I would say about maybe 70 to 80% of the people that I work with, the reason they've got, one of the big reasons why they've got their tocophobia or their fear is because of the trauma that they experienced of their own birth coming into the world. And and trauma feeds fear. So a lot of the work in dealing with the tocophobia and addressing it, big part of that will be clearing the trauma, getting rid of the trauma out there, allowing them to process that and kind of cut the emotional cord with that.
Yes.
But let's just talk me through what the knowledge, the experience, the exposure you've got to people discovering their birth experiences. I mean, let's start with yours, and what comes up when people do remember their birth experiences. Let's hear yours first.
Yeah, okay. So my own experience, which was long and drawn out in reality as well as in my rebirthing.
Okay.
I was my mother's third child. I was born in a hospital, unfortunately, because her fourth one was born at home, but hey. There are several parts of the story. One is that my dad had to leave for work in the middle of labour, which I was very upset about as the baby.
So
And I
were you
realised that.
inside at that point when he left?
Yes, my
And you
mum
were
was in
aware
labour
of him
and he was,
leaving?
yes. And I'm sure my mother was disappointed that he left too.
Yeah.
The other part was that my mother's obstetrician, who was a family friend because my grandfather was a GP and had had my mother go with his mate as the obstetrician for the birth. Is that a good idea? I don't know. Anyway, he decided that because he wanted to go away for the weekend, I would be induced so he could still go on his jaunt. I was furious. Do you know, I still am.
When you say you were furious, like...
As the baby, I was furious. Guess what I did?
What did you do?
Stayed in till Monday when I was due. Bolshy or what?
So do you think you did that on purpose because you were mad?
I don't know. It was very uncomfortable. My mother said to me once, because she was induced, and their induction method was to poke a stick and break the water. That's what induction meant then. When I say stick, it's a special stick, not a piece of wood.
Not like a twig.
Yeah. But my mother said it was very uncomfortable. It was, because certainly the four waters would have gone and I was very squished. But my experience in the rebirthing process, when I was doing the breathing and the feeling I had during that process, and it lasted several sessions, was I couldn't see the way out. Couldn't find the way out. And that was probably because my mother's womb wasn't ready. Cervix wasn't open. She hadn't started in labour. It was her third labour. She'd had relatively straightforward, speedy labours before, and this one wasn't going to be any different. So her body at that point wasn't aware that labour was necessary. And so she wasn't ready, and I wasn't ready. So she was induced on Friday, I think. Like, we'll induce you, dear, and you'll have the baby by tonight, then I can go away for the weekend tomorrow. And I came on Monday. I don't know how long the labour was, but certainly I was told I was due on that day and I was born on that day, and I was born at tea time. My mum obviously wanted a cup of tea. 3:45, I think I was born in the afternoon. So, my mother wasn't afraid of birth.
No.
And her mother wasn't either. And she puts it down to, wait for it, she puts it down to the fact that my grandmother, the family before that were brought up by maiden aunts because the mother died of cholera, I think. And so there were these two little children who were sent back from India where their dad ran a tea plantation. So they were sent back, presumably with an accompaniment of some sort, but they were only 3 and 1 or something. And they were brought up by aunts who never had children, had nothing to do with it, and so had no opinion. And my mum reckons that no brainwashing is much better than brainwashing about birth. So they had no opinion about it, so they just let their body get on with it. They trusted it.
And I've heard that mentioned again. I think I did an interview not long ago with Sophie Fletcher, the author of Mindful Hypnobirthing, and she says that young women, sort of women around about 17, 18-year-olds that are pregnant, and they don't have, because they don't have this conditioning, they tend to have very easygoing births that tend to, because they haven't had a lifetime of fear ingrained into them through culture, through films, through through wherever. So they have got a clean slate. Whereas the older you get, the longer you had to kind of take on all this conditioning.
And it's physically easier. I mean, I was 18 when I was pregnant, and so physically your body is a lot softer. It's more flexible. It's the ligaments haven't had decades of being hard and tough and strengthened. So I'm sure that's true too.
So in terms of other people who have come to you with rebirthing sessions and their births coming up, what kind of I guess, I don't know, I want to learn, I want to know about those aha moments maybe, or those insights, or maybe where they've had a
Oh,
birth and it's kind of
yeah.
explained something about
They
why they
do.
are the
They
way they
do.
are.
Yeah. Okay. So some of my favourite ones
Yeah, go on.
was a guy that I was rebirthing, and as he was born, he realised everybody in the room was frightened apart from him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, all the birth attendants, everybody was afraid,
And he
and he didn't
wasn't,
like
so he
that.
didn't pick that
He
up.
was. He wasn't. He thought he was really annoyed with them. He thought they should be better at their job. So now I can bring in another topic, which took me years to realise. Birth professionals tend to be people who've had difficult births. They're drawn into the profession because of that to heal the experience.
Mm,
But unfortunately, they then bring their own fear into every birth room they go to.
mm,
And I think that's particularly true of obstetricians, especially male ones, because they don't have the opportunity that a woman does to give birth and heal it if it's possible for her to do so.
mm,
Yeah, so now I understand why the whole hospital process becomes so angst-ridden. And I was just reading Doris Hare's report before I spoke to you because I thought I'd just get myself into gear. And she said most of the medical procedures that are carried out during births in hospital are not scientifically proven. They're doctors' common sense. So speeding up second stage, for example, speeding up third stage, all of those things have been considered by people to be advantageous.
mm,
When as far as the mother and baby are concerned, they're not.
mm.
They're not
Well, things
allowing it
like
to
giving,
unfold.
yeah, things like giving birth on your back. We know that that is not, there's, the evidence does not support that. And yet we see that everywhere, don't we?
Yeah, because it's easier for the doctor to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the only reason. It was supposedly introduced by Louis XIV, who wanted to see his mistress giving birth, and he said, "Lie down so I can watch what's happening." And because she was stupid, she didn't say, "Bog off, I'm busy." She
Yeah.
lay down because it's far more dangerous. You get the pooling of the blood behind the womb, you get the compression of the aorta, so the baby doesn't get as much oxygen. You get gravity working against you. I can't remember now who it was. Was it Janet Velasquez, the active birth woman? She said there's only one position worth for giving birth, and that's standing on your head.
That
Yeah,
says it
it's
all, though,
awful.
doesn't
But
it? That
you
does say it
imagine,
all.
imagine trying to dig a hole lying on your back. It's not an active position.
No. No. And it also adds to feelings of vulnerability and
It certainly
not
does.
being in your
It,
power,
it
which
certainly does.
is a
Yes.
huge psychological thing, I think.
I think also spiritual too, because when you think of um, the 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 way that your spine works and the way that your neck works, all of those straight things that are done, all the power poses are standing, aren't they?
Mm,
So I suspect it's something to do with gravity or magnetism or electricity, because we're electronic as well. None of these would work if we weren't electric beings.
yeah.
So there are a whole host of circumstances that all add together
Mm,
to create
mm,
what is the best. So the best positions for giving birth are
mm.
standing, squatting. Um, some people do lie down on their side, but I think that was brought in. Oh, all fours is the other one. I think that was brought in because it was a midwife's. Um, what's the word I want? The word for somebody who's giving part of what they want and somebody else is getting part of what they want.
Oh, she was compromising.
Compromise.
Yeah, yeah.
Midwife's compromise because she was still down on the deck,
Mm,
so the doctors wouldn't complain. But gravity wasn't working against her because the baby was coming out sideways.
mm,
Very intelligent midwife thought of that, but it's still not optimal
mm,
because you still aren't in control. You
mm,
still aren't the person with the power who's doing the job.
mm. So let's go back to maybe some of those insightful birth experiences, but also, yeah, is there any other kind of birth experiences that you were aware of through your work with rebirthing that kind of where people just had an aha moment about why they are the way they are?
Trying to think now.
Because but while you're thinking, I remember when I was pregnant and I was reading. I only had one pregnancy book where you could see a pregnancy week by week, and I got to a diagram of a birth canal, and I had a complete panic attack. I couldn't even look at it and had to close the book, and that was it. And yeah, I think that and I had my own fears around birth were around feeling trapped, like I had no control. And I just think now that maybe my own experience of being born was very tiny.
Yes,
I was
yes,
I was, yeah. And so that feeling of just being stuck and maybe not be able to come out, and I can't talk to my mum about that because she's no longer with me. So
yeah,
yeah, but I think the birth canal just brought it all back in a weird
yes,
way, and I couldn't. It was all irrational. I couldn't explain it because I couldn't remember
no,
it. And but
no,
seeing that image just made it so real to me, and just brought
yeah,
up the panic within me.
yeah,
But yeah, none of that was conscious. But then I'd had a hunch. I know I'm going to clear my own birth experience. I'm going to clear the trauma of it. And oh my goodness, when I cleared that trauma, I was sobbing like for about
yeah,
half an hour, just
yeah,
emotional pain that just came out of the depths of my being, that just felt like, I don't know where it came from. But yeah, I felt so good when I'd let that go. I was like, my goodness, this is where my fear had come from. And I just wonder whether this fear of death and dying, yeah, whether or not, you talked about there are some people that are born that the previous baby in the family maybe was a miscarriage, and so there's this kind of
oh yes,
energy
yes,
of death that's maybe
I
within
have
the
come
womb
across that.
space.
That's yes, that is one, and it was very common in Victorian times to use the same name for the next baby from the baby that had died. That's a bit unfair, but something I did remember that's a really common occurrence in rebirthing is that the mother is trying not to give birth until she's in the place where she's supposed to be, or the midwife's arrived, or whatever it is, and somebody tries to hold the baby back, and sometimes physically will push the baby back in
Wow.
because they don't want the baby to come until the midwife's there. So you can imagine what that does to the baby, because the baby's oxygen supply is reliant on it coming out. That's the way the future is. So all of these things that we do, and I can't think of, just trying to think of things that people have actually come up with, but certainly that pushing the baby back in one is one that people have had.
That's quite phenomenal. Yeah. And you
Yeah.
talked about you not being able to find a way out. Have you found that to be a pattern in life, that you haven't been able to find a way out of a
Yes.
situation?
Yes. Very much so. And rebirthers are well known for it. I don't know if you've heard of Louise Hay,
Mm.
but she came up with affirmations. And then Sandra Ray was somebody at the very beginning of rebirthing, as they um, formed the idea of it. And Leonard Orr was the guy who started it off, from being in a sauna where it said don't stay in here longer than an hour. So he stayed in longer than an hour to see what would happen, and his breathing changed. And then he started remembering all sorts of stuff. So that's where the idea of using a breathing technique to provoke these things came from. And Sandra Ray, in the end, because she observed so many different patterns, wrote down what she called personal laws, where a type of birth or a type of experience led to certain ways of leading a life.
Mm.
And cesarean births are absolutely classic. They always want people to rescue them from stuff.
Yeah, being pulled out of
They
a
can't
situation.
carry things through. Yeah, so there are a whole load of well-known connected patterns, with that.
Yeah.
And my parents called me obstinate because I chose to come on the day I was due and didn't do what the obstetrician wanted. And I think that's a bit the wrong way around.
Yeah. I'll tell you what though, my second daughter, she's like, we just watched Justice League this weekend, which is like loads of DC comic superheroes, and there's the Flash, which obviously goes very fast. She is the Flash. She's always describing herself as the Flash. She runs really, really fast. He was
Yeah,
Flashes in this, so she's constantly like, she's connecting totally to the Flash in this. When I was
yeah,
expecting her, she was really late. And I was 42 plus one and due for my induction
yeah.
at 11 o'clock and in the morning. And she, like the Flash, arrived in just under 3 hours, just shot out. And I had
Yeah.
like 4 hours to spare before going to my induction. And yeah,
Uh-huh.
she is like, she is. She was born as she is in the world. That's exactly how. And I do think that if people can learn more about their own birth experiences, they can learn a hell of a lot about the emotional imprints and their emotional patterns and behaviors that they
And that
have
there is
playing out.
and that there is an alternative, that there is a choice, that there is a different way. Yes. Once you understand that there is a different way, you just go and pursue it.
Yeah.
But while you're under the illusion that there is only one way, then you feel stuck. But moving from there to this close connection with the idea of birth and death, I would really like to cover this, because in our conversation that sparked off the idea of having this conversation, I was going on my hobby horse about the fact that historically people have stuck spanners in the work, obviously starting in the 15th century, was Louis the 14th, whichever century it was. That wasn't the beginning of it. There have been lots and lots of practices around birth which have interfered and made it less safe. Quite a lot of those are folk things, tribal things, but most of them currently are hospital-based pseudo-scientific things. Like, for example, episiotomy. The logic is that if you cut a straight cut, it'll heal better and it's easier and you're less likely to tear. And in fact, the opposite's true. So that's one of those doctor logic things that, oh, well, it's easier to sew up a straight cut. Well, it causes all sorts of problems for the woman that's been cut. Not a good idea. I won't go into that now. But all of these things add up to the problems women have that lead to other problems. So as soon as you interfere in one thing, like inducing, for example, you then lead that woman directly to a far greater chance of a cesarean. And the number of women dying through cesarean section is much higher than the number of women giving birth naturally, because it's an operation, and all operations have their dangers for lots of reasons I don't need to go into. Yeah. But all of those interferences lead to more maternal and infant mortality, which a woman on her own, given birth with confidence, would not come upon. And I felt so strongly about this. I had my third baby on my own. I had arranged for my favourite midwife, who'd been tending me all through the pregnancy, to come, and then it was her day off or something. And so I thought, I'm just going to trust this. And it was a good job, because the total length of the labour was 1.5 hours.
Wow.
And it started at 11:30 at night. So it was a good job. I was prepared for all that anyway. And it was great. I mean, it was just one of those short, sharp, wonderful births. I ended up on all fours, which I never anticipated, because I'd always wanted to be upright for the previous two. You don't know what you're going to feel is the right thing to do. But when you're allowed to and you just get on with it, you just follow your body. And your conscious mind is taken over by the subconscious, which when you're in labour is far more important. And if you're forcing yourself to converse with people, to meet people who are strange for the first time, to drive somewhere, to go through traffic, to worry whether you're going to get there in time, all of those things are completely the opposite of what you need for oxytocin to work, which is the hormone that squeezes the womb to get your baby out. And if you start and stop labour, there's far more likelihood that you'll have problems. It's just, as soon as you start interfering in any way, there are more likely to be problems.
Now, let me just, another part of work that you've done is assisting those that are close to death, and helping them to, I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I'd be interested to take the conversation just before we wrap up to those people that are approaching, that know they're dying, that are at the end of their life, and how do they feel about where they're at? If there's anything in that I think, those that do have a fear of death or dying, everyone's seen that article about the 5 regrets that all people on their deathbed have, and how that brings people into thinking, these are the things that matter in life, etc., etc. But I'm just wondering, with your experience of being with people at that point in their lives, if there's anything you can share about, where are they at? How do they feel about that? That might be helpful for somebody who's not at that point of their life, who's maybe in their youth, that has this fear around death.
Well, for some people, it is an improvement on what they're having now. If they're in a very, very difficult, dark place, they would rather be dead. And as a person as well as a practitioner, I am able to empathize with that, because I know from personal experience that the place you go when you die is wonderful. So I don't have such a huge need to batter somebody with the no, stay here under all circumstances. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is that when somebody is dying, physically dying, because their body is ill, they don't always know they're going. They're not always that clear, or at least not as much to say so. But I do remember a friend of mine who'd asked for my help. He was in hospital. He had not very long to live, and he'd asked to see me. He was worried about how his children were going to manage without him. They didn't have a history of managing very well. And so he was desperate not to go because they wouldn't manage without him. And I had to talk to him and speak to him, and in fact remind him that what he'd said to me was, he rang me up. He said, this is the problem. This is what's happened. I need your help with the biggest challenge of my life, which of course was actually his death. And I was able to say to him, but what you said to me was that you wanted peace, and this is what you're going to get. It's okay. And I wasn't able to stay much longer because I was, very much a visitor in a private space. But his children had asked me to come because they felt that I could speak to him in a way that they couldn't. And he did try to get out of bed because they said to me, he keeps trying to get out of bed. And he said, it's because I need to leave. Well, it's classic. He was in a hospital rather than a hospice, but it's classic hospice behaviour. People start looking for their passports and their suitcases because there's a part of them that knows that this overlapping time of when you were dying and it's a natural path for somebody who's very ill and their body can't sustain them, then they know that they're progressing to somewhere else. And their subconscious is telling them this isn't the end. This is a journey. We're travelling. We're going to be okay. I also have a family member who died a few years ago, and the priest running the service reported that she wanted the words, a particular hymn, and the words were, "Land me safe on Canaan's side." So she really felt she was preparing herself for a journey, and that as long as things went well, she would land there safely and she would continue. And you do, the connection after we've died with the family who are here is just as strong. And if we've sharpened our intuition, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, you feel are there. They're around. You can listen to their advice if it's useful, and you can say to yourself, well, they weren't that much good at that when they were alive, so I'm not listening to their advice now. Be selective about who you listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I'm sure we could talk forever, but I'm going to wrap it up now, Catherine. And so thank you so much for just sharing all of that we've talked about today. And I hope that those watching have found this conversation a useful one to listen to. If you do have any questions, then do put them in the comments. If you're catching us on the replay, then do pop your questions on the comments, but I'll keep an eye on this thread. And thank you for joining us today. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.